Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another session of Islamic at Authors. This is a weekly opportunity where I discuss with the author of a work, sort of their recent, usually very recent book. And this week, I'm really delighted to actually welcome a dear friend who I've known for many years, a seasoned scholar and academic, and someone who's recently co-authored and participated in a work of both translation and scholarly sort of exploration of the history of Islam in Britain. And so I have with myself Yahya Birt, a scholar who's he pursued his studies, if I recall correctly, Yahya, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, at SOAS and the University of Oxford. And you pursued an MPhil in social anthropology at Oxford. And currently you're the research director at the IAN Institute, a London-based sort of research institute that's concerned with Islamic affairs, broadly speaking. And you've recently translated a book, you've recently sort of participated in the production of a book. The translation from Ottoman Turkish was done by one of your colleagues. And the author of that book is someone called Yusuf Sami Asmai. And his book has been translated under the title Islam in Victorian Liverpool, an Ottoman Account of Britain's First Mosque Community. And this is the mosque of the noted Abdullah Quilliam. So, and published with Claritas Books. Inshallah, I'll share a link so that you can get your hands on this. But it really gives me great pleasure to introduce a person who's actually one of Britain's, if you'll forgive the expression, eminent historians of Islam, to discuss a fascinating find and quite an intriguing text that kind of appraises the status of a figure who has kind of been in the news, shall we say, for the last couple of decades in some capacity. So with that, let me just briefly introduce the format. I'm going to hand over to Yahya in just a moment, and he's going to introduce his book for about 10 minutes or so. And then I'll be engaging in a discussion with him with the sort of book as the sort of center of that discussion. And people are more than welcome to send in their questions if you write in the chat on YouTube or on Facebook. I don't think you can do this on Twitter, incidentally. Then it will show up on our comments feed, and we will address those later on. So please do feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and engage Yahya. It's really a pleasure to have you this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Yahya, to introduce us to your book.
Thank you very much for having me, Osama. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a great honor to be part of this very, very educative and informative series of book talks and author interviews. I'm very honored to have been asked to be part of this.
It's our honor and pleasure.
I've always particularly enjoyed hearing the lovely Omar and Shashi's book of the week. I don't know how he finds the time, but he seems to have read everything under the sun. So it's nice to be part of this. So this for those listeners and viewers who are unaware, I'll just spend 10 minutes kind of introducing, the book and why it's significant. So first of all, we're going back to late 19th century England. This was a time, it was really the height of the British Empire. The British Empire was the largest land empire in history, but it was held together by maritime routes and trade and so on. So when it came to the empire coming home, ports were exceedingly important, and Liverpool was the second port of the British Empire after London. And so much, goods but also people came through the port, and it was the main passenger port into Britain before it was replaced by Southampton in the early 20th century. So in other words, you had all sorts of dignitaries coming from all over the British Empire through Liverpool, they would then take the train down to London. And this is significant because for our book, because there is a visit to the mosque which is recorded of the Crown Prince of Afghanistan paying an official visit to the Quilliam's Mosque, which is described in detail in the book. And trying to understand why that would occur is the centrality of Liverpool at this point in time. And so there were less than 10,000 Muslims in Britain at the time. They were a mix of elite law students, many of whom, elite students, many of them studying things like law, who'd come from the elite, the Indian elite, and had come to study in Oxford and London and Cambridge and so on. And then you had a mix of servants, so you had domestic servants, often women who were nannies, who were looking after, the children of wealthy Anglo-colonial families. Then you had those known Oriental sailors, or known as Lascars. They were anybody picked up along the British maritime routes, all the way from Somaliland, Egypt, Yemen, Bengal, Gujarat, and so on. And so these so-called Oriental sailors came from a mix of different backgrounds, but the Lascars came and turned up in the port cities of Britain and often formed the nucleus of the first communities. The first Muslim communities in Britain were in the ports: London, Liverpool, South Shields, Swansea, Newport, etc., Cardiff. So this is sort of the beginning of settled Muslim communities in Britain. But the first sort of organized mosque community, and we have to be careful here what we mean by that, is an institution that's open to the public, that offers regular prayer services, and the sort of normal activities that we'd associate with the mosque. The first one that we know about that had any kind of quasi-permanent status and official recognition was the mosque in Liverpool. And like appropriately, it was a quote unquote house mosque, because like the vast majority of mosques have been in this country, and only a minority of them still are purpose built, aren't they? So, like many other mosques in this country, it was a converted house. And so
it sounds very familiar in a funny way.
It is. In some ways, it is. And but what was strange about this particular mosque was that it was founded by a convert to Islam, William Henry Quilliam. He was born in 1856, died in 1932, and the nucleus of that community were also converts. The figures are a little bit contested, but somewhere, some hundreds converted over a period of about 25 years or so. But there was a floating population of these Lascars coming in and out of the port. There were visitors, dignitaries came. All of this is recorded in the pages of a weekly magazine that Quilliam published from 1893 until 1908, The Crescent, which had a worldwide distribution and went to maybe 80 different countries. So as this book shows, is further evidence that there's the existence of a community of English converts to Islam in the second port of the greatest empire of the day, which was a non-Muslim empire, was a matter of great sensation in the East, in the Muslim world. It was widely reported in all the different presses, Turkish, Arabic, and so on. It was commented on widely. And word got around, and I suspect that one of those routes was literally along the maritime trade routes. So copies of the magazine and word through the Lascar network would go through different ports around the British Empire. So if you look at the connections that Quilliam built up transnationally, it's mostly through ports. Bombay, Calcutta, Cape Town, Perth. Let me think, where else? Lagos. All of these were port towns connected through the British Empire. So it was a global network, Islamic global network, built up from Liverpool that was connected through the ports of empire. So it was a new kind of Pan-Islamist network that was used English language as a medium for the first time, which is also very interesting. And it's using the steamship, and it's using the power of print in order to create this new network. So using what were at the time cutting edge technologies, it's like the equivalent of being on Snapchat and, and having, a cutting edge online presence. It's the equivalent of that. They use the most up-to-date technologies of the time to spread the news and word of this community. So in this context, we have news of this. This creates great curiosity. And among those who becomes interested is our author of this book, whose text we translated, who was a journalist. He founded his own newspaper in Cairo, an Ottoman Turkish newspaper called Misr. His name was Yusuf Sami Asmai. We don't know his birth date. He died in 1942. When he came to Liverpool, he's probably just about 30, from what we can tell. He was a madrasa graduate, bright, had come from the provinces, probably had gotten to a scholarship into an Istanbul madrasa, but then was sent to Egypt, a small town in Egypt, to teach Ottoman Turkish, but loved Arabic, wrote grammars in Arabic, translated several books from Arabic from Ottoman Turkish into Arabic, and over time became attracted to, but took a very much an anti-British stance, and that is because by this time, obviously, the British were in control of Egypt,
right?
After 1882,
right.
So they were in control of Egypt, and so Asmai had witnessed this really because he moves to Egypt in 1884,
right.
But what makes him of interest to us is that actually he was also a keen travel writer. So he writes at least 3 travelogues, 2 to England,
right.
this is the second, which we've translated. We've not translated the first.
Okay.
And he wrote a third one late in life, for which he learned Italian, which is a trip to Sicily, which I think was partly to do with visiting the remains of Arab Sicily, of Islamic Sicily. As well, which must have interested him, but we've not studied that travelogue. But he's partly skeptical. All this publicity, is there something real behind it? Is it some kind of colonial gambit by the British, to associate Islam with the empire? So the thing is that this was being discussed by Cairo's intellectuals of the day. There was a lively debate in the pages of some of its journals, like Al-Ustadh. Even Rashid Rida asked his mentor and teacher Mohammed Abduh about this Liverpool Mosque. Was it a political mosque, or was it a real thing? And Abduh says it must be real because it comes from the grassroots. That was his answer to his students. So it was being discussed, and Asmai was keenly interested in, and it was being regularly reported in the Egyptian press, and as well as in the Turkish press and in India and further afield. So it was, maybe it's my co-authors, and I should mention them here. It was a team effort. So it was myself, Rioda McNamara, and Munira Makdasulu who worked on this text and presented several technical challenges because it's in 5 different languages. And I don't mean all the way through, but there are excerpts from different languages in there. And also there are problems like the Asmai's own misunderstanding or misinterpretation or translation of Christian terminologies and practices into Islamicate ones, and it's not always successful. So we had to kind of flag that in the translation in order so that the reader wasn't misled, to highlight Asmai's mistakes, if you see what I mean. So
the useful footnotes actually throughout the translation in that regard.
So anyway, so I hope that's where people's out. But basically, the book is an account of his 33-day stay there, what he thinks of this community of converts, and what he thinks about its leadership, and what he thinks about its religious practices, its political stances, and so on and so forth. And it is a skeptical book. It is a skeptical book, and it will probably raise some questions about how this community is viewed today, potentially for some readers.
I mean, I think it offers, in some ways, a healthy skepticism about a time which very often has been celebrated uncritically, I think. And I think I get the impression that to a certain extent, your desire is to, inject some of that healthy skepticism into. It's not an attack per se. Certainly your effort isn't, even if Asmai sometimes does seem to be sort of have a little bit of an axe to grind, or perhaps a lot occasionally. But yeah, I found it just a fascinating read. It's also occasionally stylistically a bit interesting. The sudden sort of turns of phrase that one doesn't necessarily expect. It's sometimes quite casually written, I get the impression. And it's just, as you say, it's kind of like his journey through Britain. It reminded me a little bit of, and I wonder if you've thought of this connection at all. Is this kind of following footsteps of people like Rifa'at Tahtawi, the sort of famous imam in Paris who was sent by Mehmet Ali Pasha in the early 19th century. And he's this major sort of figure in, or seen as this major figure in Islamic reform in the modern period. And I wonder if Asmai is kind of emulating that to a certain extent. Do you have any thoughts on that? Have you explored that at all?
I think it's more likely that he's actually directly much more influenced by a kind of modern form of Turkish travel writing, which emerges in the mid-19th century. Is what you go from in Ottoman Turkish are accounts written by officials, which are more serious, if you like, more evaluative in a sort of diplomatic kind of sense, towards a more a form of popular writing where individuals are traveling and they're expressing, and there's an element of play in them. So in other words, they sort of slightly pretend to be surprised by the differences between the Turks and the British in order to amuse the reader, if that makes sense. So they kind of, the sort of surprise and astonishment is a little bit forced, shall we say. They weren't quite as unfamiliar with each other as maybe these texts sometimes play up, a sort of perplexity about the British and their foibles and so on. So it was sort of, there was a mocking tone, there's a bit of a satirical tone in us. And of course for us as Muslims, as post-colonial subjects today, where the white secular gaze is often looks at Muslims that way. It's entertaining for us and a pleasant surprise to see the tables turned. And see, because I mean, he can be a little bit, he can be condescending about the British. He can sometimes stereotype them.
It's a bit cringeworthy at times in that regard,
get things a little bit wrong. But then I think that's very familiar to Muslims today, that we are stereotyped and things about us are exaggerated and they get things wrong and so on and so forth. So Asmai isn't immune to that. But to be fair, that's why we elected to have quite a few footnotes, so that for the diligent, we pick up mistakes and things like this. But you can just read the text and enjoy it on its own. You don't want to. If you're not bothered by footnotes, you can ignore them and just enjoy, because it's quite entertaining. It's an entertaining read, and it can make you chuckle sometimes. Sometimes there's sort of broad comedy sometimes in places, I think, and so I think it can be enjoyed at different levels.
I don't know if you've read sort of like the quasi memoirs of Usama bin Munqidh, like this crusading sort of an Arab sort of fighter and general during the Crusader era, and the way in which he sort of like mocks and makes fun of the sort of the Crusaders sometimes is, I mean, it's obviously done for sort of effect, and one kind of raises one's eyebrows. I mean, I'm not sure that. I think it would probably be unfair to describe Asmai as making stuff up. I would suspect that he's kind of just portraying things and its interpretation rather than sort of. But I think he's reporting what he believes and what he's seen and what he's heard. I don't think I think he's an honest narrator, but I think there are other things going on besides that. I mean, part of it is an investigation. It's partly an investigation, isn't it, into this community, trying to get to understand it.
its beliefs and practices. At the same time, it's also, I think, doing other things like, there's a chapter sort of mocking, explaining Britain and mocking the British obsession with class and money and so on, and and describing, he's complimentary towards things like religious freedom and things. It's not completely black. It's not a completely. It's not a completely dark image of Britain, but
absolutely.
But certainly, he also can sometimes portray the most aberrant behavior as sort of normal. He kind of plots a succession of horror stories from the newspapers and says, who are these animals? He's very kind of disparaging, but I think by and large, I think he's doing different things with the text, and I think there are times when he's joking and other times when he's being serious. I think you just have to pick those apart.
So occasionally, especially when he's drawing on newspapers and anecdotes, it does seem a bit gossip column-y, so to speak.
It does. It can do.
But at the same time, you read Edward Lane Poole's, the manners and I forget the full name, but manners and customs of the Egyptians. And again, it's sometimes, despite him being an eminent philologist and scholar and so on, it's cringeworthy for the modern reader sometimes to read this stuff, the way in which these broad stroke generalizations about other cultures. But at the same time, as you put it, that's kind of standard fare for the Daily Mail, right? So in many respects, we're quite used to it. We could spend a lot of time on those things. There are some really fascinating themes, actually, that come up, which I think deserve a good amount of our attention. And before I mention them, I wanted to just remind the viewers and listeners that you're more than welcome to add questions in the comments, and we'll try and address them by around the hour mark. We're a third the way through, we're about 20 minutes in. So I wanted to ask you about sort of reflections on conversion, because this is actually something where you have personal experience as well. You have, your own, in a sense, your own positionality in this particular instance gives you insight that someone like myself couldn't really share. And I wonder how we are to assess, in a sense, this idea of, and I'm borrowing something that you said to me, conversion is a process. It's not that suddenly you're converted and it's a new you're born again, and suddenly everything's in place for a new personality. But that there can actually be a process of transformation and the gradual adoption. And this is really marked out in the book by the way in which they engage in what you describe as syncretism of a certain kind, particularly in the early years. Do you want to perhaps comment on that? And I found that really fascinating, and I have my own views on it, but I'd love to sort of like...
Abdul Hakim Murad, Tim Winter, has made this made the point in trying to plead for a sort of gradualism, that conversion, the familiarity of, say, a culture or people towards Islam or the Islamicate is sort of generations long process. It's not like you snap your fingers and everything's transformed. It's about a long, slow process of familiarization and selective adoption of cultural practices and things like that. And so when you go, you'll know better than me, but when you look back into our history, you find that conversion to Islam often was quite slow. In the early centuries of Islam, the majority were not Muslim.
And for centuries.
For centuries. So if conversion had been some kind of enforced or instantaneous process, you would have expected that wouldn't have happened, would it? And and so and then you have the long, slow, particularly outside of the areas of conquest in Asia, where the majority of Muslims hail nowadays, 80%, whatever it is. That came through very slow processes of trade, contact, spread of Sufism and things like that. Over long periods of time, and even spreading through things like agricultural chants and things like that. It kind of spread in a very slow process of osmosis. Now, I think what this book shows is what you had in Liverpool was an autodidact, Abdullah Quilliam. Is a lawyer and journalist it's a dual profession. a double training, very active
Right.
mind, very curious, had a religious upbringing as a Wesleyan, that's a kind of nonconformist Protestant. I was part of the temperance, his family were part of the temperance movement that he played an active role in, which was a kind of abstinence movement where they forswore all alcohol and took a pledge. And because they thought that the drink, the demon drink, as they called it, was destroying the fabric of society, particularly in the new cities, like Liverpool, created lawlessness and violence and so many social problems. So this is part of a response to that. They promoted alternatives like tea and coffee and so on as alternative beverages for people to enjoy. So Quilliam comes from this background, but he's a restless kind of person and sort of comes into contact with Islam during one of his journeys. He went to Morocco and there encounters Islam in 1883. Then goes through a period of self-study, embraces Islam, declares Islam in 87, probably converts a year before privately. And then sets about, what's interesting about him as a person, he said, I'm going to actually establish Islam. I'm going to preach Islam. So he starts in 87, actually preaching to others and calling people to Islam, which kind of marks him out as a significant person. And in the history of Islam in Britain. So so I've slightly lost my thread here. So I think he was self-taught, basically. I think the point is I'm trying to make. And so in creating a community from scratch almost, there was a great deal of syncretism in that. So for instance, he was reliant on 19th century Orientalist scholarship for his understanding of Islam. Washington Irving's Life of the Prophet, George Sale's translation of the Quran, travelogues about Turkey. We can reconstruct some of his early reading. And so he's not later on. That changes. He gets into contact with ulama and he's exposed to a number of but at the beginning, this is autodidacticism. This is him on his own, piecing it all together, and it's influenced by his Wesleyan upbringing, the liturgical practices of the early Muslim community. Let me just say that they had a sort of Sunday service, and they were called Sunday Divine Services with a lecture. And for up until at least 1894, the mosque was actually called the Church of Islam. The last source I could see from 1894 was a local business directory. It was described as the Church of Islam, 8 Brown Terrace. So that was how it was being advertised locally. But Quilliam had a dual problem. He had a local population in Liverpool, and the mosque was on a very busy thoroughfare. So when it first opened, they called the adhan in Arabic and English from the first floor balcony. They would get the Muslim be pelted with stones.
Right. There's a story of that.
I mean, these stories are true. The police were involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's reported in the papers. This is really fascinating. You've really done the digging here.
Yeah, this isn't made up. I mean, they had real, genuine problems at the beginning. So I think Quilliam had to sort of, why call it the Church of Islam and have a service that was exactly the same time as the service of every other church in Liverpool, 7 p.m. on a Sunday? Because I think
practiced also in a style which closely resembled the style of a church service.
Yeah, a Protestant liturgical service. Yeah, and where they would chant they would sing versifications of the Quran to Wesleyan and Anglican hymns, of the day. And Quilliam wrote several of these, and I'm working on another book now of his poetry. We reproduced several of those at the beginning. They're written with a certain meter, so they could be sung a bit like qasaid and things like that. They could be sung to certain standard meters and so on. They're written in that way. So they would have this service in the middle. There'd be a lecture, which would be more often than not vehemently anti-Christian, to distinguish between Islam and Christianity, while having this kind of form around of worship, which was very familiar. But all references to divinity, to the Trinity, are expunged and replaced by monotheism and so on. So there's an Islamic message within a kind of a Christian liturgical packaging, if you can see what I mean. And then after that, they would sometimes have the namaz after, just for the Muslims. So this service was open, and then after they'd have a separate service of the Salah. Just for the Muslims. But it's very difficult. Now, when they were portraying this in the Muslim world, they're saying these were just dawah. This was dawah and these were lectures. But clearly, when you look into the detail, and Asmai's account shows us this, clearly it was a bit more than just a lecture. Clearly, there was a kind of an element of worship to it that would have been familiar to anybody who walked in and observed it, Muslim or Christian. Yeah.
But I mean, when I read, this is what's very interesting to me. So, as you say in the critical introduction, it's kind of presented in this way. This is da'wah. This isn't really, and also what's really shocking, of course, for the sort of the informed Muslim is that they didn't seem to have a Friday service, right? They didn't have Jum'ah. They were doing it on Sundays instead.
Well, I mean, that's right, and I think that, but I should note, we don't note it in the introduction, but actually in the early history of Islam in this country, even for the post-colonial communities and migrants who came over after the war, or even before the war, quite often Friday Jummah prayers were on Sundays at the beginning.
Right. This is actually true of US Muslims as well. So in places like Michigan, when the Lebanese community in particular.
Yeah. So it's actually not out of line with any of those practices either. But the difference is because Quilliam's community had worldwide publicity.
Right.
Orthodox Muslims, imams, scholars from West Africa, from Turkey, and people like Asmai came and said, look, well, hang on, you need to do it this way. This is how you pray. This is what. So because of the attention they got, they had the hostile people outside on the street throwing stones on the but increasingly they had Orthodox Muslims visiting and saying, this isn't how you do it.
You've got this wrong.
So they had a kind of a double pressure on them, if you see what I mean. And so the autodidacticism of the early years had to fade away, or it had to be adapted.
I mean, the impression you give is that he is actually, he's not terribly happy about that pressure from someone like Asmai, but he's adapting to it as well. His community then starts to introduce something on Fridays, etc. What's really interesting, if you think of this in the various registers of Islamic thought as well, so whether it's Ilm al-Kalam, Aqidah, or in fiqh, the Hanafis, and Quilliam sort of considered himself a Hanafi ostensibly, as you put it in the text. The Hanafis don't require the establishment of Jum'ah in a country that doesn't have a Qadi appointed by the Caliph, right? Outside of Dar al-Islam, what's the point of having a Jum'ah? You're supposed to all be praying Dhuhr, actually, according to strict Hanafi reading. This is, of course, kind of faded away. Contemporary Hanafis would be horrified if you suggested that. But it's... from a theological perspective as well, I just, this seems entirely reasonable if you think about the way in which the scholars talk about, if people are outside the lands of Islam, they are excused for not knowing even the most basic knowledge about Islam. And so, some of Asmai's criticisms seem a little sort of, I think that they seem a bit like pot shots to me, but maybe I'm being unfair to him.
I think he's a bit harsh. He's a bit harsh. And do you remember that there was an imam who had been appointed by the time that Asmai turns up, who's actually quite a historically significant figure, Maulana Barakatullah Bhopali, who was in Liverpool between 1893 and 1896, ostensibly to teach the community. And Asmai says to him, look, you're an alim. Why haven't you taught them, the basics, and he gets very defensive at that point and says, yes, well, I did teach them. And, but Asmai thinks he's not done a proper job. And I think his argument, I think, is that, well, you're there, you should have made more of a difference. I don't see it, And so I think Asmai has a point. And I think that, to be honest with you, because the Indian activists, Muslim activists in Britain were well aware of the Liverpool Mosque and wanted to support it, but they did a bit of due diligence. They checked they checked his bona fides out first. They made sure that it was properly an association that was properly registered. It had names and objectives. It had a system of voting in, membership and so on. They did all of that work, and the evidence, the ongoing cutting edge research is that Barakatullah was sent by these associations to actually guide the Liverpool Muslim community. So I think that Asmai has a point when he criticizes the Maulana for not doing his job properly.
But at the same time, I would, I'd probably imagine that Barakatullah also had his sort of like reasonable defense that, if you were just one person going against the sort of the prevailing practice, and everyone just thinks. I remember going to the US, incidentally, and this is, I hope it's not too invidious to sort of talk about my US Muslim colleagues, but I mean, going to parts of the US where the Muslim population is rather thin, and I remember seeing sort of a young Muslim lady sort of pray Jumu'ah in shorts, right? And no one said anything, right? Because it's a very young community. It's not sort of you don't need to make a big deal out of things for communities where they're just trying to have a communal moment, where they don't really have the sort of levels of knowledge that would make that an issue, as it were. And I'm technically an alim in that sort of context. I didn't feel it was my place to say anything at all, right? So it's a tricky sort of situation.
No, I understand why that's sensitive. I think it dramatizes the dilemma of new communities, where there's always a sort of an experiment, this gradualism where I was talking about earlier. There's a kind of slow accommodation or fitting in towards an orthodox form of Islam, but it doesn't happen overnight. And I think that this is a tension sometimes between new convert communities like this and Orthodox Muslims who look askance at the kind of gap between the reality and the ideal. And so it dramatizes that for our first mosque. And I find that fascinating that, this has been captured in this account. That these dilemmas are not new, but very old,
So there's this fascinating account which you might enjoy reading in. It's kind of used as a very short sort of anecdote in or a vignette in Michael Cook's Ancient Religions, Modern Politics, in the introduction, and he talks about the Chams or the Cham people. I don't know if you've heard of this people's. They're based in, I think, sort of Vietnam, Thailand, that sort of area.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
And basically, they at some point, I think in the 19th century, a Muslim traveler comes through, and they all considered themselves Muslims, and they would, but they worship the sun, right?
Okay.
And it's fascinating how the traveler comes, and Michael Cook's making a point about, well, it's not, Islam isn't completely like a silly putty that you can fold into anything. It's kind of his critique of overdoing the anti-essentialism, which you might expect from a scholar like Michael Cook. But, I think he makes a fascinating point there where he says, well, this traveler comes and, they're worshipping the sun, and, they fast on the day of the deity Muhammad, which is Monday or something like this, right?
Okay.
And he's like, wait, you've got this wrong. And they actually start to adjust. That there is a kind of reference that they see as Islam that they have to adapt to in order to be, more authentic to that tradition. It's fascinating what happens to traditions as they travel away from sort of sources of orthodoxy, as it were. But the fact that another thing I find fascinating about that particular book is he talks about the way in which Islam is extremely resilient. People don't leave it; they're unwilling to relinquish it in sort of most of Islamic history. And I think that that's true, even if it goes into this kind of absurdly corrupt form for the Orthodox, so to speak. There are actually hadiths which talk about that, being the case near the end of times, where people would just say, my parents said something, and therefore it's.
Well, I do think that one of the things that does shine through these early communities is that the fundamentals of Islam, they've got the ethical fundamentals of Islam straight, and that does come across, that they've understood the message of monotheism and so on, and they have attachment to the Prophet, so that the fundamentals are there, and they believe they believe in the fundamental beliefs of hereafter and so on, and so that's all there. And in fact, Asmai warns against making anathematizing this community for aberrant practices, and says that would be the uncivilized and uncalled for step to take. You know, but Barakatullah is worried. He says, you know, if you write about some of their unorthodox practices, you're going to get the ulama in the East issuing fatwas of condemnation, which is what they do, you know.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So they have this debate, and you know, and
is that something you mentioned? I didn't pick up on that.
It's mentioned in the book. Yeah, it's in the correspondence from Barakatullah. Okay. We reproduce a couple of his Arabic letters that he wrote to Asmai
in the appendices
in Cairo. Yeah. So they're there.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I'm going to have to. I mean, I kind of, you know, being a bit naughty, I skipped the appendices, but actually I was reading through the biographical sort of information, really fascinating stuff. I mean, it's really the text is actually not a major part of the overall text. There's so much rich other rich material there, translations of correspondence, as you put it, biographical information, as well as the critical introduction. So I really do recommend for viewers to sort of get their hands on it. It's a sort of in my estimation, quite an enjoyable read if you're even not a scholar or an academic or anything like that. It's really a fun read. I wanted to shift gears, if it's okay.
That's fine. You shift gears.
Because, you know, we're talking about sort of so far theology and orthodoxy and syncretism and all that stuff, but Quilliam has another resonance in the current era, right? And one thinks of the recently deceased Quilliam Foundation. I won't say Rahmatullahi alayhi. And so, you know, in a sense, Quilliam has been used as a kind of battering ram, you could say, in the anti sort of pan-Islamic discourses of our times, you know, so what's called anti-Islamism in our own time. But yet he is a pan-Islamist. I mean, this is what you kind of have already alluded to, he's kind of networking on a global scale. And I kind of have two questions. One is to think about the ironies of that across time, and particularly in the early 21st century. But I'm also interested in thinking about a little bit about Pan-Islam in light of people like Jamil Aidan's assertions that these are modern inventions. So we can deal with, you know, that a bit later if you like, and we can start off with. But any reflections and thoughts on what it means to be an ummah?
Yeah, well, I think that well, there's a lot there to get into. I think that you know, whether let me simplify things at the danger of generalization and say that for Muslims in the West, there is actually our history isn't just post-caliphate. So there is a bit of history that's during the period of the ending of the Ottoman state, and you know, the ending of the caliphate as an institution in the Ottoman domains, and in 1924. So there is a period of about 30, 40 years where Muslims are active in the West, where they actually are appealing to caliphal authority. And in fact, there was a play, Muhammad by Hall Caine, that the caliph played a role in 1890 in objecting to, and the play was withdrawn from the London stage. And what was interesting was that Indian Muslims in Britain, and Quilliam as well, were played a part in the campaign against the play and its staging. So it was seen as disparaging to the Prophet, right? So I mean,
so
several ironies
before the satanic verses.
Exactly, yeah. Nothing is that new under the sun. And the irony, of course, is that Quilliam was very good friends with the younger brother of the playwright, because they were both from the Isle of Man. Anyway, that's a small aside.
Has that been studied, incidentally, in the secondary literature?
Yes, there's a PhD on the campaign about the play. The PhD on the play. I'll send you the link.
I'd love to read it. I mean, I'm particularly curious if anyone's done a comparison between that and a century later.
I'm not aware of that, actually. I'm not aware if that's been done or not.
Because if you don't mind me saying, I mean, maybe a decade and a half ago, we were having a conversation, and you mentioned that, you know, a number of people, including in public life in Britain, consider the satanic verses as this watershed moment in the history of Islam in Britain. And it's like, wait, you're actually 100 years late,
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, the thing is
Right.
that that campaign against that play was what put Quilliam on the map internationally. And that was what brought him the attention of Yildiz,
Right.
of the Caliph himself personally.
Right.
And Matt Sharp, who's done a lot of work in the Ottoman archives on the converts, Quilliam and Alexander Russell Reb is his contemporary in America. You have personal letters from Quilliam to the Caliph talking about the Liverpool Muslims and his family and what was going on in that community, which were addressed directly to the Caliph. So they did have a personal relationship. He did visit on a number of occasions. And so this is a very striking example of how, and Quilliam the Caliph conferred honors on him as well as on his oldest son. As
and
well as some of the
Asmai's
members
book.
and banned Asmai's book, probably at Quilliam's request. Probably I'm fairly certain it was at his request, although there's
it would make sense.
I mean, so they had a close relationship as one could expect in the circumstances, given that they live so far apart. So this is a direct example of patronage from the center of symbolic and political center of Islam, I guess, the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate at the time. And so Quilliam's Pan-Islamism was a strange thing. It was a kind of doctrine of dual loyalty to crown and caliph. So he supported a kind of entente cordiale, a cordial relationship between the British and the Ottoman empires. And of course, in mid-19th century, that was the case. They had been allied. But over the course of the 19th, going into the 20th century, they grew apart and relationships became more antagonistic. And Quilliam was caught in that antagonism. So his doctrine of dual loyalty was becoming increasingly out of fashion, particularly as we rolled up to the First World War, where, of course, they were on opposite sides of that war. So the thing is that the tensions were growing throughout Quilliam's time in Liverpool. Anti-Ottoman sentiment was on the increase, being drummed up in Parliament and so on and so forth. And there were various, there were allegations and controversies about atrocities and so on in the Ottoman domains against the Christian Armenians and so on. So the thing is that Quilliam was in the crosshairs on all of that and spoke out on those issues and so on. So the thing is that he was in a precarious position because his doctrine of dual loyalty meant that whenever the two imperia came into conflict with one another, he was caught in a sort of a web. Now, Asmai, when he comes, he has a more straightforwardly anti-British stance. He doesn't think it's possible to be loyal to crown and caliph. He's saying to Quilliam, you have to pick sides. After all, he had witnessed the British takeover of Egypt,
the Arabi Rebellion, the crushing of the Arabi Rebellion.
So he was looking askance at Quilliam's position, saying it's not possible to build a Pan-Islamism from Britain in English. The center of Pan-Islamism has to be Istanbul. The language of that revival has to be Arabic. He was quite clear. He thought what Quilliam was doing was pointless. I think that Asmai didn't appreciate the new power of the print and steamship and the fact that you had something like 5 times the number of Muslims living in the British Empire as you had living in the Ottoman domains at the time. So you had something like 100 million Muslims in the British Empire. You had something like 20 million Muslims in the Ottoman domains. So that meant that Quilliam had a ready-made audience of millions. And he was building up that audience. So I think you can see why there was suspicion in Egypt and Cairo about this project, but why center a Pan-Islamism from Britain? Could it be an imperial ploy or gambit of some sort? You could see why there was suspicion swirling around it.
But how do we square that with the fact that he has the ear of the Sultan for a period as well? Like, presumably...
I'm not talking about. I'm talking about perceptions. I'm not talking about. But I also think his own position had inbuilt tensions in it because dual loyalty to crown and caliph would come unstuck when the British and the Ottomans clashed. and Quilliam would be caught in between and would have to pick a side at that point.
Yeah.
And so this is where
it sounds so familiar, to be honest.
It does, doesn't it? And that's why I think it's useful for us to reflect on that now. But when we have pan-Islamic solidarity now, in the absence of a caliphate, it's not really the absence of the caliphate that makes a difference. It's the fact that it's questions of loyalty, belonging as a minority in the West is still more salient for shaping our political conundrums and our political challenges. That would be the point I would make, reflecting on Quilliam's experience and our experience today. It's ironic that, as you say, the Quilliam Foundation, which was sort of named after Quilliam as a sort of facile kind of branding of a kind of, deep, authentic British Islam rooted in a pioneering figure. I mean, the branding was done without any historical literacy. But to be fair, the community wasn't generally aware of Quilliam, even back in 2007 when the foundation was formed. Ron Jeeves's biography only came out 3 years after that. So general knowledge of Quilliam was very poor at that time. Now he's a better known figure now, 20 years later, whatever, he's now a better known figure. But he wasn't, it was just a name. It was just a name really back then. So I can slightly excuse Ed Hussein and Majid Nawaz for that.
It was in some respects a masterstroke, right? I mean, they're basically just tapping into prejudices within sort of the broader society and Whitehall to a certain extent, and using a name like this to sort of create a bridge artificially. And at that point in time, as you say, there's no consciousness of his complex history as an individual. And so it's, they played their cards, smartly. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't them that came up with the name in any case, right?
No, well, I wonder actually, Quilliam, one of his book Tahrir, I think has always been fascinated with Abdul Hamid II, who was the patron of Quilliam's chief patron, and his Tahrir in Britain have always been fascinated by Quilliam. So I do wonder if there is a Hizbi connection in the naming of the foundation as Quilliam, because obviously both Majid Nawaz and Ed Hussein had an earlier career within his Tahrir before they became counter-extremism aficionados. So it's a strange world in which we live. But anyway, I think today loyalty and belonging and the way in which kind of the Quilliam name was weaponized by the foundation, I mean, it speaks to the same issues around the fact that a loyalty test is put upon the complex affiliations that Muslims have. So I would say in our post-colonial context, we basically have sort of three dimensions to our political identity. I mean, one is ummatic, our solidarity to Muslims wherever they may be, a general sort of feeling of solidarity with them. And then we have a kind of a diasporic or homeland or ethnic connection to back home, wherever that may be. And obviously in the Muslim case, that is dozens of different homelands. It's not just one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not. There is no one Zion. There are dozens of them. And the third one is our national sense of belonging in our country of birth or long-time residence. So it's those three: nation, ummah, and ethnos or diaspora. Those are the three channels along which our complex sort of political identities sort of operate. But even the ethnos one, just the middle one that you mentioned, is complicated by the fact that, for example, both you and I have children who, what is their ethnicity, right? I mean, our spouses are from sort of other ethnicities than our own. And so, that becomes very complicated even further. The way it plays out is the way that those simple things, I've sort of simplifying it down to three main things, but they in any individual case they become complexified But I think it's a useful enough way to think about the tensions between different political projects. And the way that I look at the war on terror is basically sort of saying that, ethnic or ummatic political affiliations or loyalties are suspect and nationalist ones are not. And that's essentially how. I mean, there was also, obviously, during the war on terror, there was like a civilizational register as well, which was bigger than national politics. So there was like the West versus Islam kind of tension that was running through the sort of Sam Huntington, clash of civilizations thesis that became popular, popularized during the war on terror. That in and of itself,
But 100 years ago, I wonder. Forgive me, sorry.
Yeah,
please, you can sort of like conclude.
No, go on, carry on. Sorry, so 100 years ago, what?
100 years ago, there was, I can't remember when the Ottoman Empire started being called the sick man of Europe, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was roughly sort of around the time that Quilliam was entangled with it, right? And so that sort of East-West divide, Orientalism, of course, would be quite strong at that time as well. To my mind, I wonder if the war on terror and our own sort of discourse is basically just that on hyperdrive, so to speak, because the difference between now and difference between the Satanic verses and the effort by Abdullah Quilliam and the Muslim community at that time is they were successful. The Satanic verses was, not, and that's because of the power differential. The post-colonial condition is far weaker than when they actually had even the remnant of a caliphate in the Ottoman era. I wonder, I'm speculating here, but I think the circumstances of the Muslims in many respects, they're far more disempowered than they were at the time that Quilliam, perhaps not. India was under sort of the yoke of the British Empire, but the Muslims right now are arguably under the yoke of a Hindu nationalist state. So,
yeah. No, I don't know how the fine gradations of comparison would tot up the different power differentials, but I think it's just enough to say that there are differences with the late 19th century, as you say, the absence of the caliphate being the biggest. But I think some of the dramas around loyalty and belonging are very familiar to us. So I think that there are things that resonate down to our generation's experiences.
Absolutely. I'm a little conscious of time because I've just realized, Maghrib came in. You're a bit further north, so it's probably come in a bit more recently for you. And so I did have sort of one last series of questions, in a sense, to ask you about. This is like the final point that you shared with me actually earlier on WhatsApp, and I wonder if this is something that we can take as the final sort of question. In a sense, me too, 120 or 130 years ago, so to speak, if that makes sense. So there is this dimension that comes up in the text, and it's again quite sort of in some respects quite shocking, in the sense that Quilliam seems to have been convicted at some point by the Liverpool magistrates of having tenants who were basically engaged in brothel keeping or something along those lines. And you go into, Asmai kind of makes a reference to it, but it's obviously such a sort of scurrilous reference that you need to go and substantiate it, and you've done a good deal of digging, which it is quite impressive and an excellent bit of historical investigation. And I wonder, you kind of, in a sense, have raised a question that we're thinking about today as well, because periodically we have religious leaders popping up who are sort of caught in the crosshairs of their own moral failings, particularly with respect to women, or sometimes with respect to funds and embezzlement. This also comes up as a sort of concern with the Liverpool Muslim Institute, or what Asmai constantly denigrates as not being worth the name of Liverpool. It's just a small sort of project, so to speak. And I wonder if you wanted to reflect on this a little for, in a sense, you've written a fantastic book from a historical perspective of interest to historians, but it's also something that Muslims as a community need to reflect on, perhaps, at this moment in time. So yeah, I wonder if
I mean, I appreciate you that time is ticking, so I'll be brief, and perhaps we can just, if you want to come back to it in Q&A, we can do that.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what do you do when you're a teacher or you're a historical figurehead like William, or a mentor, or somebody you've benefited from, turns out to have feet of clay? In other words, they themselves don't uphold fundamental parts of the values that they've imparted to you. What happens if they're all too frail and they have fallen? What do you do? And I think back to when first years when I became a Muslim, and we read Hayat al-Sahaba, the lives of the companions by Maulana Yusuf Khandalawi. And in that, he had a chapter on Abu Bakr's speech about what he said after the passing on of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the kind of way he steadied the community at that point, and knowing that that our beloved Prophet has passed on, but Allah is ever living and ever subsisting, and if your faith is in Him, then that continues. And so it's that story, it's that advice of Abu Bakr's that I turn to when I feel upset by these sorts of revelations, whether that concerns a teacher today, a sheikh or teacher, ustadh today, who's fallen short of Islamic ethical standards, or an historical figure. This is, at the end of the day, it cannot shake the tree of the trunk or roots of faith. The tree of faith cannot be swayed by these things. I mean, this is a test from Allah. Is our faith in people, in our leaders, if you like, or exemplars, or is it in Allah and His Prophet? And so this is the test of faith. It's a test of faith. If you see it as a test, I don't think you can. We go through the 5 stages of grief. Denial, anger, and so on. You see all of these bargaining. You see all of these reactions to the bad news of somebody who's fallen from grace. So this is why the story. What happens here is that you have in this book is that you have members of the community, including a Muslim woman, Nafisa Keep, who is already ringing the alarm bells about things that are going on in the Liverpool Muslim Institute. Is wrote to the leaders of including, we produce her letter to the Caliph. Also, she's
really a thorn in their side.
She writes a letter to the Crown Prince of Afghanistan, who had recently visited the Liverpool Mosque, and so on. And I think it convinces Asmai as well that when he's visiting Liverpool, that he seems to take, and also it joined in the criticism by the local Ottoman trade consul to Liverpool as well. So they're not on their own, and that there are a number of unnamed members of the community who come forward and verify some of the allegations as well. Their letters reproduced in the book. So it's not just there's not just a sole critic, if you know what I mean. She's sort of front and center, and she's expelled from the Liverpool Muslim Institute after during Asmai's visit. He witnesses her expulsion. But there were others who were being critical who go unnamed. So I think that what's important is that in reflecting all of this is that how do our Muslim institutions today respond to criticism? And quite often, we do go through this kind of denial and vilification of the whistleblower, if you like. That the kind of allegations of ghiba, of backbiting and namima, gossip and tale-bearing and so on are the go-to explanatory things, and not investigating complaints seriously enough. Everything is done to preserve the reputation. reputation of the individual, the sheikh, or the maslak, or the jamaat, or the
right.
And so on. That is the kind of
it overrides overrides any conception
overrides
of
any assessment of the claim.
right.
That it's an immediately a reputational war, and I think that we're still too quick to go to the reputational kind of flame wars on social media, and we're not very minded to try and dispassionately get to the bottom of things, which I think is what we need, is calm adjudication. Now, I mean, when it comes in historical texts like the one that we've translated here, it's very difficult for us as historians to really get to the bottom of everything. What we've tried to do is where the primary sources allow, we've tried to elucidate any claims that are made, but we don't come down firmly on their truth or falsity, because I don't think the historical record such as it exists allows you with absolute certainty to do that. Certainly not to a legal level of evidence.
Certainly
but what you can say is that there's a great deal of smoke around, and certainly it raises questions in which we kind of try. We offer a couple of alternative explanations as to why Abdullah Quilliam would be mixed up with a brothel. To this extent, and we go into that in the introduction in some detail to try and unpack it.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I thought that sort of interpretive effort is actually quite sort of it's quite helpful in many respects. You raise kind of two things as far as I can tell in your response to this. One is the sort of faith dimension, so a kind of personal sort of sense of trouble that arises when people witness these sorts of things, and in people they invest a huge amount of confidence and trust, and sort of feel that in some respects they are the basis on which they have climbed to where they have in the faith, and then suddenly that ladder's been drawn from beneath them. And then the other dimension is the question of accountability, and those are two distinct concerns, because in a sense the Sharia is concerned about people's reputations being tarnished, but where wrongs have been perpetrated, that is obviously a balancing consideration. The Sharia is concerned with false accusations primarily, and so I mean there is a delicate balance to be had there, and especially where we're a relatively weak community that is sees itself as still trying to get on its own 2 feet in many cases. And then when these sorts of things happen, it really can be traumatizing for a lot of people. And I think just to maybe share a reflection on the faith testing side of things, at least from a Sunni perspective, and this is true in a Shia perspective beyond the Imams as well, incidentally, no one is ma'soom. So this can happen to, and there's a saying that's attributed to Al-Junayd, I believe. He's asked, can a wali commit zina? Can a wali sort of engage in illicit sexual relations? And he kind of lowers his head for a moment, and then he raises it and says, وَكَانَ أَمْرُ اللَّهِ قَدَرًا مَقْدُورًا. God's sort of decree is always going to happen. And so even a wali is fallible to that extent that they can go really to the sort of what is seen in the Quran as one of the worst sins, right? And so I think the message from that is, look, don't, as Imam Malik says, from everyone you can take and you can leave some, except the Prophet. You take everything from him. He's got asma in our tradition, right? He doesn't make those mistakes. Everyone else is fallible. So that's the faith side of things. Accountability, I really find a lot more challenging. I've been personally looking into the question of rape allegations, and this is a massive question in the Western sort of jurisdiction or juristic context right now. That the vast majority of rape cases are not conviction, do not lead to conviction, because it ultimately ends up at he said, she said. These aren't things that happen in the public eye, and what can you do about that? This is, I think, a major question at this cultural moment in the West, actually. But what can we do
But
to help people to...
what about the kind of? I feel that the popular discussion is very hung up on the four witnesses argument, which I
No,
don't really,
I don't think, I do think
which I think is a red herring, because
that's a red
obviously
herring. No, from a juristic perspective, that's irrelevant.
you've got discretionary ta'zir.
So
So I you know,
so that's
responses. So
as far as I understand, and I haven't explored this very thoroughly, but that's specifically in the case of two people consensually engaging in, you know, illicit relations. And to bring that to a sort of legal setting, you have to bring four witnesses. That's fair enough. But where someone, you know, again, I haven't gone and explored this in great detail, but my understanding is that, you know, that does highlight the importance of preserving people's reputations, especially where people have basically engaged in something consensually. Where it's not consensual, where there's basically an act of aggression on the part of, you know, overwhelmingly a male, that's different. I think things become very murky, and this is where people like Ingrid Mattson and Rani Awad are some of the best scholars who are currently dealing with this question, the question of spiritual abuse and the use of the attacking of vulnerable individuals. Sometimes, like, there's a shocking case in the United States of a minor being groomed until she turned 18, and then an imam, so to speak, in inverted commas, abusing them, you know, literally, you know, engaging in sexual relations with them. And so those sorts of cases, I think, are where things become very murky, because that's not consensual in my view, right? That cannot be seen as consensual, but things can start to become a bit more messy when they're older. And this is a very complicated question. And I think we as a community need to engage it very seriously. And I really appreciate the work of scholars like Ingrid Mattson and Rani Awad.
I mean, I agree that we have to think a lot more hard about what informed consent and what consent actually means in the light of our understanding of modern analysis of various forms of psychological manipulation and abuse and so on, and what that means ethically and morally in religious settings. You know, I think spiritual abuse is a relatively new term. It was coined in Christian circles only maybe 5 or 6 years ago. The academic literature is even less old than that. It's only like 2 or 3 years old. But nonetheless, I think that there's enough in common, notwithstanding quibbles that you could have about, you know, Islamicate notions of autonomy and consent and selfhood and so on. You can quibble over some of those, but generally speaking, a lot of it is transferable. All the issues around coercion and so on, a lot of it isn't that different and is applicable. So I think that there's something here, because I think that we have to we have to understand that there are a range of behaviors that go from the unethical to the criminal. And when I say criminal, I mean criminal in a Western legal context. If we're talking about Muslim minorities, you know, some things will be captured in criminality, but a lot of behaviors that we're very concerned about won't be the purview of Western criminal law. And so there will be behaviors and standards that we want to see upheld amongst our religious authorities and in our religious institutions that were not covered by the law. And I think we have to address that. We can't say, well, let's just leave it to the courts. That's an abdication of responsibility, and we have to find a way through this that goes beyond trial by social media, which is, you know, basically where we are at the moment. Anything that falls short of criminality, and you know, and as you said, the vast majority of even criminal acts, certain kinds of criminal act never make it to court, right? So there's that whole problem.
Criminality especially is basically, I mean, this is where some of this stuff, it fares better in civil courts because the burden of proof is much lower, right? And that's the challenge, because criminality is beyond reasonable doubt, and that's a very high bar.
Yeah. So I think we've gone off the topic a bit here,
Yeah.
but what
No, I mean, I think this is actually quite relevant to what you've written about.
Yeah, to come back to the book, it's my fault. I should be, but I think that these serious allegations were made around sexual propriety, concerning Quilliam and embezzlement, and so while not all of the allegations can be substantiated independently, certainly they raise issues around this historic figure. And, we thought that it was our duty to present the text, but allow readers to make up their own minds. And I know that, some people were troubled by this. I debated myself, would this impact, say, on the work of the Abdullah Quilliam Society? And I took the step of contacting them in advance and giving them notice that this translation was being done. I even gave them a copy of the manuscript for them to have a heads up, not for them to censor it or anything, but just to give them time,
of course,
between its finishing of the manuscript and the publication, to give them time to formulate a response. Because obviously their project is bound up with the reputation of Abdullah Quilliam as an historical figure. So, he's an important part of their, his standing is very germane to their work. Let's put it that way. So I think that I felt a duty towards them and their work, but as an historian, I felt we had a duty to bring this text to light, because it's of historic importance. It is, after all, an independent account by a Muslim intellectual of our first mosque community in Britain, and just that in and of itself makes it important and deserving of seeing the light of day.
I mean, this is one of those dilemmas, which I'm glad that it's in your judicious hands, to be honest. So inshallah, may Allah grant you tawfiq in that effort. And I've really sort of thoroughly enjoyed reading the text, but also learned a huge amount. And this conversation's also been really, I think, fascinating, insightful, beneficial, and I hope that our audience will sort of acknowledge that. It's had a fair few likes. And actually, I should have addressed this earlier. Someone actually asked a question earlier. I'm just going to maybe conclude on this, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Firstly, Samina Awan gave salams, and then Hassan Rasul asked, fascinating that they would render versifications of the Quran in Anglican hymns. I doubt that there are any archived recordings, but if there are any, would be great to enjoy. It's more of a comment, I suppose, but are you aware of, I mean, there wouldn't be recordings for something which from the 1800s.
There are no recordings, but it could be reconstructed, because we have the lyrics, we have the words, and we also know which hymns they were based on. So with the help of somebody versed in Anglican and Wesleyan hymnal tradition, we could reconstruct.
Do you have musical notation anywhere, or?
Well, there's an online. We know which hymns they were often based on, or to what meter they were written in. So you could either reconstruct, or you could do an approximation.
Okay.
So it's possible, If Hassan wants to get in touch, then we can try and give him some places to explore.
Right. So Hassan Rasul, of course, is a very sort of capable, in a sense, musicologist for the Islamic tradition, shall we say?
Exactly, yeah. Hassan has some work to do for us.
Right. Jazakumullah khairan, Sidi Yahya, for really a wonderful hour and 20 minutes of reflecting on your text, and for publishing the book with your co-authors. I mean, it's really wonderful to see a team of scholars working on a complex text like this, because it's a multilingual text, as you put it. And I think that people should try and get their hands on it and really reflect on this moment in our history in Britain, but also this moment in global Islamic history, because it ties together Afghanistan, British India, and most notably the Ottoman Empire, including Egypt at that time, which had an ambiguous status, as you say. So it's a national piece of national history, but also multinational history, and that's what makes it so interesting. And it's now not just available from the website of the publisher, but it's also on Amazon, and you can get a Kindle format as well. I just read today, so as well as a paperback. So Jazakumullah khairan. Again, I can only thank you for your time, and apologies that I mean, of course, we have to make sure that we've left ourselves plenty of time for Maghrib. So apologies to any viewers who were hoping for a bit more, but I think this has really been massively rewarding. I look forward to, inshallah, seeing you in the not too distant future. Sidi Yahya. And I just wanted to let the viewers know also that next week we'll be having, I guess, a colleague of both of us, Shuruq Naguib, from the University of Lancaster, talking about her very wide-ranging writings. But I'm going to actually look at different writings of hers. So she'll be our author for next week's Islamic Authors.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair for having me. It's appreciated, Osama.
It really is my pleasure and honor to
hopefully see you soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
All right. Take care. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.